in 1995, a respected pastor from Willow Creek, South Carolina, took his two sons on a weekend camping trip and never returned. Authorities suspected a tragic accident, but the case quickly went cold. Then, nearly 26 years later, a hidden cassette tape surfaces inside a crumbling church wall, unraveling a chilling truth no one in the quiet town was prepared to face. The morning sun had just begun to filter through the pine trees lining the back porch of the Moore residence when the front door creaked open. Reverend Dennis Moore stepped outside with a camping backpack slung over his shoulder and two sleeping bags tucked beneath his arm. His sons, Caleb and Ryan, trailed behind him, buzzing with the thrill of the weekend ahead. It was the first camping trip the three of them had taken without Elaine, Dennis's wife, who had to stay behind for work and church committee obligations. The boys, 13 and 11, were dressed in matching flannel shirts, khaki cargo pants, and the kind of warm hiking boots that told of backyard adventures, but not much more. "All right, fellas," Dennis said, giving them a warm glance as he popped the trunk of their aging Ford Bronco. 2 nights, no TV, no games, just the woods, our tent, and enough marshmallows to keep you both quiet. Caleb grinned. "Can I start the fire this time?" Ryan added. "And I want to do the scary story tonight." Dennis chuckled, sliding their gear into the back of the vehicle. "One at a time, boys. We'll have plenty of time for fire stories and maybe even a few night hikes." Caleb appeared at the doorway, her hand tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. She looked more anxious than she usually did. "Dennis," she said softly, walking to him as he closed the trunk. "Are you sure this is a good weekend for this? There's still so much going on with the board?" Dennis looked at her, then gently placed a hand on her arm. "It's just a weekend, Laney. We need it, the boys need it. And honestly," he said, his tone lowering slightly, "I need it too." She didn't press further. She simply kissed each of the boys on the head, then hugged Dennis tightly. "Be safe," she said, "and call me if you get any reception up there." "Will do," he replied, climbing into the driver's seat. The car pulled away with a rumble, kicking up gravel from the driveway as Elaine stood and watched until they turned out of sight. That would be the last time she ever saw them. 2 days later, when the boys were supposed to return for school and Dennis for his Monday sermon, the Bronco didn't show up. Elaine waited anxiously for hours, calling Dennis's cell phone repeatedly, only to go straight to voicemail. By midnight, she called the sheriff's office. By morning, a full-scale search had begun. The campground they were headed to, Lake Briar Campsite, was remote but not unreachable. Rangers searched the area, volunteers canvassed trails, and helicopters scanned tree lines, but nothing turned up. No vehicle, no gear, no trace. It was as if the woods had swallowed them whole. Elaine insisted to authorities that Dennis would never just disappear. "He's a man of faith," she pleaded, "a father who loves his children. He wouldn't do this to me." But whispers started circulating. A few months before his disappearance, Dennis had openly questioned the church board's handling of certain funds, specifically a renovation budget that had quietly grown by tens of thousands of dollars. He had become vocal, even confrontational, at a recent board meeting. "He was under a lot of stress," one elder told investigators. "Maybe he cracked, or maybe he ran," another said. "You don't just vanish like that." Local news ran the story for weeks. Pastor and sons vanish on church trip, but the public interest faded as summer arrived. No new leads came, no ransom calls, no sightings, just silence. Investigators eventually reclassified the case as a likely voluntary disappearance. One report suggested Dennis may have staged the trip to escape financial scrutiny, possibly fearing repercussions from something he uncovered or was involved in. Elaine never believed it. If Dennis was afraid of anything, it was failing God and his boys. Not money, not church politics. She refused to move, kept their home intact. Caleb and Ryan's rooms untouched. Birthdays were still quietly marked. Christmas stockings still hung. "In case they come back," she would say. Over the next 25 years, time etched lines into Elaine's face. Friends moved on, the church changed leadership, and Dennis Moore's name became little more than a footnote in Bennettsville's small-town memory. But Elaine never stopped believing they were still out there, or that someone knew more than they let on. Elaine Moore sat in the middle of her living room, surrounded by a mosaic of cardboard boxes, each one filled with the fragments of a life she never planned to leave behind. After nearly 3 decades in the same small house on Shady Oak Drive, she had finally made the decision to move. The property had grown too quiet, too loud for one person, and the ghosts of memory whispered too loudly in every room. But still, as she taped shut one box labeled "Kitchen, Fragile," and reached for the next, she hesitated. Her fingers lingered on the edge of a dusty wooden trunk stored beneath the staircase, a chest she hadn't opened since the summer of 1995. She exhaled, knelt slowly, and opened it. The smell hit her first: aged paper, dried glue, cedar. Inside were layers of old blankets, newspaper clippings about missing persons, and sealed manila folders from the particular count. She had kept everything. Her eyes scanned the bottom of the trunk, and there, wedged between the last blanket and the floorboard, was a small black notebook with frayed corners. Her pulse quickened. The cover bore no title, but as she opened it, the handwriting was unmistakable. Dennis's. The date at the top read, May 10, 1995. It was a sermon draft. Her eyes fell on the title, The Cost of Integrity. She inhaled sharply. That was the last sermon he had spoken about before he left. She remembered the way he had sat at the dining table late into the night, scratching out thoughts in silence, muttering passages from Scripture, and shaking his head as if wrestling with something far larger than theology. Elaine turned the pages slowly. Dennis had outlined the message carefully. When righteousness threatens the status quo, silence becomes the currency of fear. He had scribbled verses from the book of Micah, Proverbs, and a long note that read, "What is the cost of exposing sin within the sanctuary? Can truth survive when it must indict those in power?" Elaine blinked back tears. These were not the notes of a man planning to flee. They were the thoughts of someone preparing to confront something painful, something he knew would have consequences. One particular line was underlined twice. His pen pressed so hard it nearly tore the page. "There is betrayal in sacred places." Her breath caught. That wasn't just a theological musing, that was a warning. She flipped further, her hands trembling. The rest of the notebook trailed off unfinished, the writing growing more hurried and fragmented. The final line, written at the bottom corner of the last page, simply said, "If anything happens, look under the floor." Elaine sat still, notebook in hand, the weight of the moment anchoring her in place. What had he meant by that? Which floor? The sanctuary? Their home? She placed the notebook on the coffee table and stood. Her knees ached and her hands were shaking, but her mind had locked into a different rhythm, a blend of grief and resolve. She walked into the study, Dennis's old room which she had left almost untouched over the years. His desk remained against the far wall, its drawers still filled with old pens, church bulletins, and sermon templates from the 1980s. The floor was hardwood, worn smooth in the center where his rolling chair had once lived. Elaine knelt again, this time with a claw hammer in hand. Her movements were careful, methodical. She tapped along the seams of the floorboards, listening for change. After several minutes, one board sounded distinctly hollow. She pried it up slowly, fearful of what she might find and what she might not. Beneath the lifted board was a narrow cavity, dark and dusty, but something was inside. She reached in and pulled out a folded envelope. On the front, in Dennis's careful cursive, were the words, "To be opened only if I do not return." Elaine's breath shuddered out of her. She sat back, eyes wide. The envelope was yellowed and brittle. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. Dennis had written, "If you are reading this, it means I didn't make it back. I never intended to vanish. If someone says I ran, no, it isn't true. I've uncovered something involving the church finances. I've asked questions I wasn't supposed to ask. I believe there are 2 men, possibly more, who know what I know and don't want it revealed. If anything happens to me, find the ledger. It's not here. I left it where the moss meets the stone." Elaine read it twice, then a third time, before placing it back into the envelope. Her heart raced with the weight of a vindication she hadn't realized she still needed. She wasn't crazy. Dennis hadn't abandoned them. He had been onto something dangerous. But who were the men he referenced? Church elders? Board members? Her memory reached back through the fog of time, names like James Weller, Donald Fry. men who had long since left the area or passed away. She stood, envelope in hand, and returned to the coffee table. The notebook and the letter, together, painted a new portrait of the final days before Dennis's disappearances. He had been preparing not for escape, but for confrontation, and he had feared the price. Elaine looked at the window. Outside, the street was quiet. Spring had begun to bloom along the hedges, but inside her, something colder stirred. She reached for her phone and began to search for names from the church archives, old board minutes, property ledgers. If Dennis had left clues, they were not random. Where the moss meets the stone, she repeated softly to herself. She had heard that phrase before, but where? The knock came just after dusk, when Elaine was stacking the last of her packed boxes by the door, preparing for the movers the next morning. It was an odd time for a visitor, especially in a neighborhood that had grown quieter over the years, filled with retirees and weekend silence. She hesitated for a second, glancing through the side window. A man stood on the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray windbreaker and faded jeans. He wasn't familiar, yet something about the way he stood, the tilt of his head, stirred a memory long buried beneath layers of grief. She opened the door cautiously, still holding her phone in her hand. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes, deep brown and tired, met hers and held them there for several seconds longer than normal. Then he spoke, his voice soft, cracked. "Mom," he said. Elaine's grip on the doorframe faltered. She took a step back, staring. Her lips parted, but no sound came. "It's me," he said, voice trembling now. "It's Caleb." The name hit her like a stone to the chest. She shook her head slowly, unable to accept what she was seeing. "That's not funny," she whispered. "Whoever you are, this isn't—" "I know it's hard," he interrupted, pulling a small, worn photograph from his jacket pocket. It was weathered, yellowed at the counter. Elaine took it hesitantly, her fingers brushing his. The photo was unmistakable. Caleb and Ryan in their camping gear, Dennis kneeling between them, arms around their shoulders, all three smiling in front of the Bronco. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Where did you get this?" she asked, tears pooling in her eyes. Caleb didn't answer. He simply opened his arms, and after a moment, Elaine collapsed into them, clutching her son for the first time in over 2 decades. Inside, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where Dennis had once drafted sermons and where Caleb and Ryan had spilled cereal and colored picture book. Time had aged them both, but in that moment there was no space between years, only the raw, aching reunion of mother and son. "Where have you been?" she asked finally. "What happened to you, to your brother, to your father?" Caleb looked down, tracing the rim of the coffee mug she had placed before him. "It's a long story," he said, "but I need you to listen all the way through. It's not going to be easy." Elaine nodded, bracing herself. "I don't remember everything from that night," he began. "I was 13. It was dark and we'd just finished setting up camp. Dad seemed tense, not like himself. He got a call on this old walkie-talkie. We didn't have cell service. Said someone from the church board was coming to meet him. He didn't say why." Elaine's face tightened. "Who was it?" "I didn't see their face," Caleb replied. "Ryan was asleep in the tent. I stayed by the fire. I heard voices, arguing. Dad was saying something about the money not adding up, that he wouldn't let it slide. Then there was silence. When I went to look, he was gone." "Just gone?" Elaine swallowed hard. "Gone how?" Caleb's gaze darkened. "I think they killed him. I didn't see it, but I know it. I was grabbed from behind. Someone covered my face, dragged me away. I fought, but I was just a kid. The next thing I remember, I woke up in a strange house. A man named Carlton told me my name was now David Grant. He said my family died in a fire, and I was lucky to be taken in. I didn't believe him at first, but I was scared. He told me I'd go to foster care if I told anyone what I remembered." "That no one would believe me?" Elaine sat frozen, hand trembling around the edge of her chair. "Reverend Carlton?" she repeated. "He was from a different county," Caleb nodded. "Never part of our church. I think he was brought in to clean things up, keep us separated. Then took Ryan too. I never saw him again after that night. We were split up. I spent the next 15 years thinking I'd imagined it all. They even showed me photos of a fake family and told me those were my real parents. But something inside me always knew it was wrong. I kept dreaming about the campsite. About Dad's voice. About you. "And you never tried to find me?" Elaine asked, voice cracking. "I didn't have a name to search," Caleb said. "They told me my last name was Grant, but when I turned 21, I requested my records and saw the inconsistencies. I started digging. Took years, and finally, when I found a picture of you from an old church bulletin online, I knew." Elaine reached across the table and took his hand. "Your brother," she whispered. "We have to find Ryan." Caleb nodded. "I've already started. I found a few records, adoption files, but I think he might be in Ohio. I just don't know if he remembers anything. Or if they told him I died too." Elaine's mind reeled. The notebook, the letter, the message from Dennis. Now, Caleb, alive, carrying pieces of a shattered past back to her doorstep. She stood, walked to the cabinet, and returned with the sermon notebook and the envelope Dennis had left. She placed them on the table. "Your father knew something," she said, "something that made people desperate enough to kill. He tried to warn me. Now it's time we follow his trail." The old house fell into an uneasy silence after Caleb's confession, the air thick with the weight of what had been revealed. Elaine sat with the notebook in her lap while Caleb leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the corner of the ceiling as though staring at the place where memory took shape. After several minutes, he spoke again, his voice lower, slower. "There's more I didn't say earlier. It came back to me last year. Not all at once, but in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle dumped onto the floor. And then one day, they started fitting together." Elaine looked up. "What kind of memories?" Caleb didn't meet her eyes. Night before the trip, Dad was in his study. He had that reel-to-reel tape recorder on, the one he kept hidden under the cabinet. He thought I didn't know about it, but I saw him setting it up once. Said it was for transcribing sermons, but he only used it late at night. Elaine furrowed her brow. "You think he recorded something important?" Caleb nodded. "I'm sure of it. I was supposed to be asleep, but I remember hearing voices." Heated. 2 men. Dad was arguing with them. They were in the front room and the door was closed, but their voices carried. He paused, rubbing his temples. One of them was definitely James Weller. I recognized that deep, slow voice of his. The other, I wasn't sure until years later, but now I know it was Donald Fry. Elaine's stomach turned. Donald Fry had been a rising figure in the church back then, always dressed in impeccable suits, always smiling at potlucks and offering prayer with just the right amount of dramatic flair. "What were they arguing about?" she asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Money. I remember Weller saying something like, 'You don't know what you're talking about, Dennis. This is how things work in every church.' And Dad," he was furious, "said something about a $45,000 0-cents withdrawal from the building fund. Said he'd checked the accounts twice and couldn't find any board-approved purpose for it." Elaine gasped softly. "That was the new roof project, wasn't it? But I thought—" "Yeah," Caleb said. "Only the roof never got replaced, and then that summer Weller bought a new car and Fry expanded his house. Dad didn't say it outright, but I knew he suspected embezzlement. That's why he had the recorder. He was documenting everything." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. The last thing I heard before he turned the volume down was Weller saying, "If you don't back off, you'll lose more than your job." Elaine felt her pulse pounding in her ears. "And he still went on that trip?" "He had no choice," Caleb replied. "They told him to take time off. He didn't want to make you worry, so he told you it was just a camping trip. But I think he knew something was coming. That's why he took us." Elaine clutched the edge of the table. "Do you think he brought the tapes with him?" "Maybe," Caleb said. "But if he did, they weren't with him when he disappeared. Whoever orchestrated this knew what they were doing. They got rid of everything that could incriminate them." Elaine stood and walked slowly to the hallway, to the closet where Dennis had once kept his briefcase. It was long gone, of course, but she knelt anyway, searching through old shelves, boxes, things she had been meaning to throw away but never quite could. "I remember him hiding things," she said, "but I thought he was just being paranoid. He stopped discussing board meetings with me, said it wasn't safe. I didn't understand what he meant until now. Caleb joined her, pulling down a dusty plastic container labeled Church Admin 199011995. Inside were old meeting notes, typed memos, handwritten reminders. Near the bottom, under a folder of weekly sermon topics, was a slip of paper in Dennis's handwriting. Confront both before finance report, July 1. Elaine held it in her hand as if it were a live wire. He planned it, she whispered. He was going to bring them to the church council. But they struck first, Caleb finished. He made sure he wouldn't make it to July. Silence lingered again, broken only by the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Elaine suddenly turned to Caleb. You said something earlier about where the moss meets the stone. Do you think that's connected to where he might have hidden the recordings? Caleb's eyes lit with a flicker of recognition, too. Yes, there's a path near Lake Briar where we were supposed to camp. It's near a clearing with moss-covered rocks and an old chapel ruin. Dad pointed it out once, said it used to be part of the original campgrounds before they built the modern site. We need to go there, if anything's still left after all these years. It's worth the trip, Caleb said. I don't know what we'll find, but if he left something, that's where it would be. Elaine stood, resolve steadying her voice. Then we go tomorrow. Caleb picked up the sermon notebook and the letter from the table, slipping them into his satchel. As he did, something else fell from between the pages. A photograph. Elaine picked it up. It showed Dennis in a group photo, standing beside Weller and Fry, the three of them smiling stiffly at a church fundraiser in the spring of '95. But in the corner of the image, just barely visible, was the edge of a tape recorder peeking out from under Dennis's podium. Caleb looked at it. He wasn't just documenting meetings, he said. He was recording from the pulpit, too. The next morning broke with a heavy overcast sky, the kind of gray that turned pine needles a darker green and sent cool mist curling across the Carolina backroads. Elaine sat in the passenger seat of Caleb's rented Jeep, hands folded tightly in her lap, the same notebook Dennis had once held, now resting beside her. Caleb drove in silence, navigating turns with careful precision, as if retracing a path not only through terrain, but through memory. "What's up past the reservoir?" he finally said. "You have to go off-road for a bit, but I remember it clearly. There was a rusted sign that used to read Old Mill Campground nailed to a tree. It was already abandoned even back then." Elaine glanced at him. "How do you remember so much after all these years?" Caleb's grip on the wheel tightened. "I didn't. Not until recently. But ever since I started facing the truth, it's like pieces keep unlocking. Smells, sounds, even specific trees. I think trauma buries memory the way earth buries bones. But when you dig..." He trailed off. The Jeep rumbled over a rough patch, then veered onto a narrow trail lined with thick brush and sagging branches. After 20 more minutes, the trees began to thin, revealing a wide, overgrown clearing where nature had reclaimed most traces of human presence. At the far end stood a dilapidated wooden structure, barely visible under vines and moss. What remained of a ranger shack, or maybe an old tool shed. "This is it," Caleb said, shutting off the engine. Elaine stepped out slowly, the chill in the air sharpening her senses. The forest was utterly still, except for the occasional creak of trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Over there," Caleb said, pointing past a collapsed fence. "That's where Dad parked the Bronco, and just behind it there used to be an old pickup truck." He led her through the undergrowth to a wide mound of earth, flat and oddly uniform. The soil was packed hard, but a corner revealed rotting planks beneath dried leaves. "I think they used concrete over this," he said, crouching down. "Dad showed me this spot once. Said it was used for storage decades ago, but something about it always seemed off. I thought it was just an old foundation." Elaine's voice shook slightly. "You think this is where they buried him?" "I don't just think it," Caleb replied. "I feel it." Within 2 hours, a small team arrived, led by a man named Russ Donnelly, a veteran of terrain surveys and cold case support. Russ listened carefully as Caleb explained what they were looking for. "If there's concrete, we'll need to break it carefully," Russ said. "Don't want to destroy anything underneath." As the team began clearing the brush and pulling back layers of soil and rotted wood, the area began to take form, An old cement slab, roughly the size of a truck bed, cracked but still mostly intact. One worker brought over a handheld scanner. "There's definitely metal under here," he said. "Could be a frame, possibly a vehicle." With jackhammers and pry bars, they carefully chipped away at the slab until the corner of rusted metal emerged, a door panel, heavily corroded but unmistakably part of a truck. Elaine stepped back, covering her mouth. The sight of the vehicle, buried and forgotten in the woods for 25 years, struck her like a physical blow. Caleb stood rigid beside her, eyes locked on the spot as the workers cleared more of the debris. Then came a discovery that froze the team in place. A weathered, leather-bound wallet, embedded beneath the edge of the cab. One of the crew members opened it with gloved hands and turned it toward Caleb. The name on the ID card was faint but legible, terribly clear. It required solid, stable snow to catch it forward, but government officers, engineers, and the doctor turned it toward Caleb the spee. The weathered cabinet whispered, "William Dover?" Terrett was, "We'll need to stop here and call the authorities." It is now a crime scene. By late afternoon, local police and forensic specialists had arrived. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and cameras flashed as evidence was cataloged. Caleb and Elaine gave statements, retelling the events that had led them to the site. A few hours later, a coroner approached them gently. "We've found skeletal remains in the driver's seat area," he said. "We'll need to run DNA tests to confirm identity, but based on the wallet and personal items, we're treating this as the probable remains of Mr. Moore." Elaine nodded numbly. She had waited 25 years for certainty, and now, standing on cold earth where her husband had been left to vanish in silence, she felt no closure, only fire. Caleb knelt at the edge of the cleared site, staring at the place where the windshield would have been. "He didn't just die here," he said. "He was hidden, buried under cement, like he never mattered. Like the truth didn't matter." Elaine joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "But the truth is surfacing now, and we're going to keep digging." The following Sunday, Caleb returned to the very place his father had once called sacred, the First Shepherd Baptist Church. The building had changed little on the outside, still painted the same pale cream, the cross atop the steeple now weathered with time, its edges rust-stained by years of storms. Inside, the pews gleamed with fresh polish, and the organ's soft hum filled the sanctuary as if nothing had ever happened. Elaine chose to remain at home, unable to face the ghosts in the aisles. But Caleb knew he had to be there, not to worship, but to confront. As he stepped through the front doors, the stairs began. Heads turned, murmurs rippled like distant thunder. He recognized a few faces, gray-haired couples who once attended potlucks with his family, Sunday school teachers, even one or two men who had served on the church board when his father did. None of them approached. He sat quietly near the back, watching as Pastor Harris, the current leader, ascended the pulpit. The sermon touched on forgiveness, the dangers of suspicion, the sanctity of reputation. It wasn't subtle. After service ended, Caleb stood and made his way down the center aisle. A few people offered polite nods, but most avoided eye contact. Outside, near the front steps, he caught sight of Deacon Gerald Barnes, a man who had been vocal in defending the church's leadership during the time of Dennis's disappearances. Caleb approached him. "Deacon Barnes," he began, "do you remember me?" Barnes hesitated, then forced a smile. "Of course, son. You're Caleb. It's been a long time." "Yes, sir," Caleb said evenly. "I came back because we found my father's remains. In the forest, hidden in a buried vehicle." Barnes's smile faltered. "I'm sorry to hear that. Truly. Do you remember the controversy over the financial records? The missing building fund?" Barnes shook his head slowly. "That was a long time ago, son. Things get exaggerated. I remember your father was under a lot of pressure. I always thought maybe he just couldn't take it anymore." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "You think he killed himself?" Barnes shrugged. "Sometimes good men break under bad burdens. The church had problems. Your father wanted change, but maybe he took on too much." "He was murdered," Caleb said flatly. "There's no ambiguity anymore." Barnes raised his hands. "You'll want to talk to the police about that. I'm just a servant of God. I don't know what happened." With that, he turned and walked briskly down the steps, leaving Caleb standing alone. Similar conversations played out with others. Soft deflections, faded memories, veiled comments about not reopening wounds. No one wanted to speak plainly. No one wanted to remember. As the crowd thinned, an older woman in a floral dress lingered near the rear exit. She wore thick glasses, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Caleb didn't recognize her at first until she stepped closer and smiled gently. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked. "I used to clean the classrooms. Name's Alcott. Mildred Alcott." Caleb nodded slowly. "You were here during my dad's time." "Oh yes," she said. "I knew your father well. He was a kind man. Walk with me?" They moved around the side of the church, out of view of the sanctuary windows. Mrs. Alcott reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. "I kept this all these years," she said. "Never knew if I should give it to anyone, but now, with everything that's come out—" Caleb took the envelope, unsealed. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the ink slightly faded but still legible. It wasn't signed. The message read, "Reverend Moore, if you keep pushing this, you won't be preaching next Sunday. Stop asking questions about the renovation fund. Some doors are better left closed." Caleb looked up. "You think this came from someone on the board?" Mrs. Alcott nodded slowly. "I don't know who wrote it, but I found it on your father's desk the day he left for the camping trip. I came in to clean, and it was just sitting there, out in the open like he meant someone to find it. I put it in my apron pocket and took it home. Couldn't bear to throw it away." "Why didn't you say anything back then?" he asked. "People were scared," she replied, "and ashamed. We trusted our leaders too much, and by the time things got quiet again, no one wanted to believe anything bad had happened." Caleb folded the letter carefully and placed it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said. "This helps more than you know. Just promise me something," she said. "When you find out the truth, don't let them bury it again." The next day, long before the sun had climbed above the tree line, Caleb stood once again in front of First Shepherd Baptist Church, staring at the brick exterior as if it held the answers he had been chasing for decades. The sanctuary was locked tight, but the basement entrance, around the side, an old metal door that creaked like a protest every time it opened, was still used for storage and had long since lost its lock. He slipped inside quietly, flashlight in hand, careful to avoid the broken tiles and cardboard boxes stacked high with seasonal decorations and unused hymnals. The air was musty and cold, carrying the scent of paper rot and time. At the far end of the basement was what used to be his father's office, and a small room with a narrow window and a warped wooden door that now bore a sign, "Maintenance Supply, Authorized Access Only." Caleb pushed it open slowly. The space was unrecognizable. Shelves now held paint cans, extension cords, broken vacuums, and old light fixtures. But beneath the clutter, the layout remained the same. He moved aside a stack of plastic chairs, revealing the faded wallpaper behind which, as a child, he had once watched his father disappear momentarily to adjust something behind a panel. He remembered asking what it was for, and Dennis had smiled and said, "Just an old preacher's trick." Caleb stepped forward and began tapping gently along the wall. One section gave way with a shallow cavity no more than a foot wide. Inside, wrapped in a cloth stained with time and dust, was a rectangular object about the size of a lunchbox. He pulled it out slowly and unwrapped it, a vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder, dented but intact. Alongside it was a single labeled reel, June 27, 1995. Boardroom. Caleb's hands trembled as he cradled the machine. He knew what this could mean. He carefully packed it and left without disturbing anything else. Back at his motel room, he set the recorder on the desk and stared at it for several minutes before daring to plug it in. The machine gave a low hum, the internal mechanisms whirring to life like a mechanical resurrection. He threaded the tape gently, set the spool, and pressed play. Static filled the room, followed by the low clatter of shuffling papers and footsteps. Then came his father's voice, clear, steady, unmistakable. "I've reviewed the statements, Donald. This isn't an accounting error. $45,000 doesn't just disappear." There was a pause. Then the deeper voice of Donald Fry responded, sharp and irritated. "Watch your tone, Dennis. You're treading on dangerous ground." "No," Dennis said firmly. What's dangerous is pretending we don't owe this congregation transparency. I've served here for 12 years. I know every donation, every tithe, every fundraiser. And I will not stay silent while this church is turned into a bank account for two men who think they're above God's work." A chair scraped. Fry's voice rose. "You're accusing me of theft?" "I'm stating facts," Dennis replied. "If you won't explain where the money went, I'll bring it before the church this Sunday. I've already drafted my statement." Another pause, tense and electric. Then Fry's voice dropped lower, more threatening. "You do that, and you'll regret it. This congregation doesn't need another scandal, and you don't want to end your ministry like this." "This isn't about me," Dennis said. "It's about truth." The tape crackled, followed by the sound of someone approaching the mic and switching it off. The recording ended abruptly. Caleb sat frozen, heart pounding. The voices echoed in the silence of the room. His father had been moments away from exposing everything. Fry had threatened him directly, and now, with this tape, the silence of the past was finally breaking. Caleb rewound the reel, played the key portion again, and then recorded it onto his phone for backup. This was proof, actual, tangible proof, that Dennis Moore had uncovered embezzlement and had been silenced for trying to reveal it. He reached for his bag and retrieved the envelope Mrs. Alcott had given him. The warning now felt like a final puzzle piece snapping into place. Dennis had been right. The money was real, the corruption was real, and now the evidence was in his hands. He turned off the recorder, sat back in the chair, and closed his eyes. The air in the room seemed to shift, no longer heavy with doubt, but brimming with clarity. It was time to confront the living shadows that had once buried a man beneath a forest floor. But first, he had to decide who he could trust. He couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. As he stood, a plan began to form, not of revenge, but of revelation. The truth had slept long enough. With the tape recording now in hand and the weight of his father's final confrontation echoing in his memory, Caleb delivered the audio file and all corroborating notes to Detective Laura Finley, the officer newly assigned to the moteps, to the table that was beyond Dave, no less with a no-nonsense demeanor that quickly won Caleb's trust. Within days, she secured a warrant to question Donald Fry, who had retired and relocated to a quiet retirement community just outside Gainesville, Florida. Fry's home was pristine, perched at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, his lawn neatly trimmed and an American flag fluttering from a polished pole. When the doorbell rang, he answered in a cardigan and slacks, looking every bit the part of a retired pastor living a tranquil life. But as soon as he saw the badge, his eyes narrowed. "I've already told the authorities everything I know," he said sharply. "It was years ago." Detective Finley remained composed. "We're reopening the Moore case based on new evidence. We'd like you to come to the station for a formal statement." Fry huffed, but didn't resist. At the station, seated in a sterile interview room with a cup of untouched coffee before him, Fry kept his answers short, guarded. "I didn't go to that forest," he insisted. "I wasn't involved in whatever happened to Dennis Moore. We may have had disagreements, sure, but to imply I had anything to do with his disappearance is slander." "Mr. Fry," Finley said, sliding a photo across the table, "do you recognize this location?" It was a shot of the old mill clearing taken by police during the excavation of the buried vehicle. Fry glanced at it briefly. "No, never been there." "That's interesting," Finley replied, "because earlier, when describing the last time you saw Reverend Moore, you said he was upset, muttering something about meeting someone out near the grove with the rusted sign." "That grove is only accessible through this very clearing." Fry's mouth tightened. "Slip of the tongue," he said. "I must have heard it secondhand. Lots of rumors were going around back then." Finley leaned forward. "No one outside the search team ever referred to it as a grove. That's not in any public report. So how did you know it was there?" Silence stretched long between them. Fry looked away. Caleb, who had been watching through the two-way mirror, turned to Finley's partner, Officer Reed, who gave a slight nod. "We've got him on the edge," Reed said. "He's not admitting it, but he knows more than he's letting on." Back at the precinct, Finley began digging into old contractor records, cross-referencing names tied to church projects around the mid-1990s. One name popped up again and again: Carl Bannon, a local truck driver and hauler who did occasional work for church events and facilities. Cax, Caleb, and Finley tracked him down in the outskirts of Bennettsville, where he still lived in a modest ranch house filled with tools, faded photos, and the scent of old motor oil. Carl, now in his late 60s, greeted them with suspicion, but agreed to talk when he heard the name Dennis Moore. "Yeah, I remember Dennis," he said, settling into a recliner. "Didn't go to his church, but he was a good man, always tipped well when I helped unload chairs for revivals." "Why, you ask?" Finley kept her tone neutral. "Do you recall doing any hauling work for a man named Donald Fry in the summer of 1995? Carl's eyes narrowed. "Fry? That preacher with the fancy Cadillac? Yeah, once or twice. I remember one job clear as day. He called late June, said he needed me to transport something big. Said it was church furniture, a donation or something." "Where did he have you take it?" Caleb asked, leaning forward. Carl scratched his chin. "Said he wanted it dropped off in an old foundation site near Old Mill Road. Gave me real specific directions. We drove out there together in my flatbed. The thing I hauled, it was a huge wooden crate, heavy as hell. Told me not to ask what was inside?" "Did you ask Mom, ma'am?" "He had someone else waiting there, another guy I didn't recognize. I just dropped the crate and left. Didn't sign no paperwork, got paid in cash. But now that you're bringing this up, that whole job gave me a bad feeling. Always did. Would you be willing to give a sworn statement?" "Hell yes," Carl said. "If it helps clear Dennis's name, I'll say it loud." Back at the precinct, Finley confronted Fry again, this time with Carl's statement on tape. Fry's face changed. The calm mask he had worn for hours began to crack. "People misremember things," he said weakly. "He's an old man. He's probably mixing me up with someone else." "You sure about that?" Finley asked, placing the recorder on the table and pressing play. Carl's voice came through clearly, recounting every detail. Fry looked down, his jaw working. Caleb, brought into the room moments later, stood across from the man he knew had silenced his father. "Why?" Caleb asked. "You had power, influence. Why was a man's life worth less than your comfort?" Fry didn't answer. His eyes glistened, not with remorse, but with fear. Finley's voice cut through. "Mr. Fry, you are now formally a suspect in the homicide of Reverend Dennis Moore. You have the right to remain silent." The interrogation room was quiet, the buzz of the overhead fluorescent light a low hum against the tension now crowding the space. Donald Fry sat hunched forward, elbows resting on the metal table, his carefully manicured composure long since abandoned. The silence stretched until he exhaled, slow and defeated. "Fine," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You want the truth? I'll give it to you." Detective Finley, seated across from him with a recorder already rolling, gave a slight nod, but said nothing, letting the weight of Fry's confession settle on his own shoulders. Caleb stood behind the two-way mirror, fists clenched, his chest tightening as he watched the man who had helped bury his father speak the words they had chased for 25 years. "Dennis was a good man," Fry began, eyes unfocused, lost somewhere far behind him. "Too good. That was the problem. He believed in accountability, in transparency, in honesty, like it was the air he breathed. James and I, we didn't." He rubbed his temples, then looked up. "It started with one investment, a commercial property in Columbia. We told ourselves we'd repay the funds once the returns came in, but it spiraled. We used the building fund first, then dipped into the mission fund. Eventually, Dennis caught the discrepancies. He brought them to the board, quiet at first, thinking maybe it was a clerical issue, but once he saw the patterns, he knew." Finley's voice was calm. "And he confronted you?" Fry nodded slowly. "He came to me in my office, told me he'd found the records, said he knew the properties were in James's name, but the transactions were traced through a church shell account I authorized. He gave me a deadline, said he'd bring it to the full congregation if we didn't explain it publicly." He paused, swallowing hard. I panicked. James was furious. We argued. Then Dennis said something about bringing in the county auditors, said if we didn't come clean, he'd resign and take the evidence straight to the police. What happened then? Kincan asked. Fry's hands shook slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. We met that Friday evening at the church office. James was late. Dennis was already packing a briefcase. I tried to reason with him, begged him to wait, but he wouldn't listen. He said, "I'll speak on Sunday. I owe that much to God." His eyes darkened. Then James showed up and everything went wrong. The argument turned physical. Dennis shoved James. James shoved back. I stepped in, tried to separate them. Dennis slipped, hit his head on the edge of the desk. There was blood. He didn't move. Fry went silent for several moments. Caleb watched him, unmoving, the numbness in his limbs spreading like cold. "So you didn't mean to kill him?" "No," Fry said, shaking his head. "It wasn't premeditated. But once it happened, we didn't call for help. We stood there in shock. Then we started talking about what it would mean, the scandal, the fallout. We made the worst decision possible. We decided to cover it up by faking the camping trip." Fry nodded. "Dennis had mentioned he was taking the boys to Old Mill that weekend. We used that. I drove his Bronco out there, staged the gear. We cleaned the office, got rid of anything obvious. Then we took his body. We put it in an old crate from the church storage. James arranged the burial with a guy he knew, a logger. Someone paid in cash, no questions asked. And the children?" Finley's voice was steel now. "Could you justify what you did to them?" Fry's face broken. "They're asleep. We didn't know what to do. Caleb was older, already starting to ask questions. James said we had to separate them, said it was the only way to keep the story clean. He had contacts, families in 2 different congregations out of state sympathetic to the church cause. They agreed to raise the boys under new names, told them their parents had died, said it was a tragic accident. We moved fast. By the time anyone started asking questions, it was just speculation. "So you stole their lives," Finley said. "You buried their father, then erased their identities." "We thought we were protecting the church," Fry said weakly. "It was wrong. God help me, it was so wrong." In the observation room, Caleb turned away from the glass, bile rising in his throat. The rage, long buried under years of confusion and grief, finally had a face. A voice, a confession. Finley leaned forward. "We have your statement on record. You're going to be charged with multiple counts: manslaughter, obstruction, conspiracy, and unlawful removal of minors. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Fry whispered. "And James Weller?" "He died in 2012, Fry said. Heart failure. Took the secret to his grave. Then you'll answer for both of you," Finley said, standing. "And the children, Caleb and Ryan, they'll finally know what happened to their father." Fry didn't respond. He only looked down at his hands, palms stained with the past, unable to scrub clean what he had helped destroy. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read. Donald Fry sat motionless at the defendant's table, his once proud posture now stooped with age and consequence. The judge's voice rang clear, cutting through the stillness with calm finality. "For the crimes of involuntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, unlawful removal of minors, and falsification of identity, the court hereby sentences you to 25 years in federal custody without the possibility of parole." Caleb sat behind the prosecution bench, Elaine at his side, both of them gripping each other's hands as if bracing against a wave that had taken decades to reach shore. Around them, the courtroom was filled with quiet observers, members of the current congregation, retired law enforcement officers, reporters, and a few familiar faces from the town who had once called Dennis Moore their pastor but had long stopped speaking his name aloud. Fry didn't speak. He simply nodded once, lips pressed thin, and allowed the bailiff to cuff his hands and lead him away through the side door of the courtroom. He would live the remainder of his years behind bars, not as a man of God, but as the man who helped destroy one. A week later, under the bright spring sun and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut grass and honeysuckle, Dennis Moore was finally laid to rest. The ceremony was held at a modest cemetery near the edge of town, far from the politics and whispers of the church where he had once preached. A new headstone bore his name, along with the words Caleb had chosen. He stood for truth when others ran. He walked with integrity, even when it cost him everything. Elaine stood beside her son, tears streaming down her cheeks, not only for what they had lost, but for what had been found. The coffin lowered slowly, accompanied by a hymn Dennis used to sing at home, "Be Thou My Vision," softly played by a single violinist from the community orchestra. After the service, Caleb stepped aside from the crowd and opened the folder he had carried with him every day since the trial ended. Inside were documents, names, and the trail that had finally led him to a small town just outside Columbus, Ohio. After months of searching and cross-referencing old adoption records and school yearbooks, he had found his brother. Ryan Moore, now living under the name Thomas Grady, had grown up in a stable but quiet household, working as a mechanical technician and volunteering at a local youth center. When Caleb first called him, the reaction was silence, then disbelief, and finally a voice cracking through decades of repressed confusion. "You're real?" The brothers met 2 days after the burial in a park midway between their towns. Ryan approached cautiously, his gait uncertain, eyes flicking with recognition and fear. But when he stopped in front of Caleb, there was no doubt left. "I remember your face," he said, "from my dreams." Caleb didn't speak. He only stepped forward and pulled his brother into an embrace that neither of them released for a long time. They sat on a bench and talked for hours. Caleb told him everything, about Dennis, about the truth that had been hidden from them for so long. Ryan listened in stunned silence, then pulled a small silver pendant from around his neck. "I've had this since I was little," he said. "Never knew where it came from, just always felt like it meant something." Caleb took it in his hand, recognizing it instantly. It was Dennis's, the same cross pendant he wore in every family photo. The brothers sat quietly as the sun lowered across the sky, and for the first time in more than 2 decades, neither of them felt alone in the world. Meanwhile, Elaine began work on something her husband would have believed in. With the help of a few trusted church reformers and community organizers, she established the Dennis Moore Foundation for Religious Financial Transparency, a nonprofit dedicated to providing oversight tools, accountability training, and legal support for whistleblowers in religious institutions. The foundation's mission was simple: to ensure that no leader could ever again hide behind stained glass walls to exploit trust and power unchecked. The launch event was held at a local community center, attended by faith leaders, accountants, and survivors of church-based financial abuse from across the region. Elaine stood before the crowd, wearing the same navy blazer she had worn the day Dennis was buried, and spoke into the microphone with a voice strengthened by years of loss and quiet perseverance. "My husband believed that faith must be rooted in truth," she said. "He paid the ultimate price for standing by that belief. This foundation is not only his legacy, it's a safeguard for every churchgoer, every donor, every community that has ever placed their faith in leadership. May it never be misplaced again." Applause filled the hall, and somewhere in the back row, Caleb and Ryan sat side by side, both smiling quietly as they watched the woman who had never stopped believing. In the weeks that followed, the brothers began spending more time together, hiking, cooking, sitting through old photo albums Elaine had preserved like sacred scrolls. Caleb moved closer to Ohio, eventually taking a position with the foundation to help lead investigative outreach. Ryan, after months of soul-searching, legally reclaimed his name, Ryan Moore. It was not just a return to Ohio, but a declaration that the silence had ended, that they were whole again. The past had not been erased, nor could it be, but it had been met with truth, and in that truth there was peace. On the anniversary of Dennis's death, the 3 of them returned to the cemetery. Elaine brought flowers, Caleb brought a framed photo of the whole family from years ago, and Ryan brought the pendant, placing it gently at the base of the headstone. The wind stirred the trees around them, and for a long moment the world seemed perfectly still. "We're home, Dad," Caleb said quietly. "And we didn't let them win." Elaine took both their hands, and together they stood before the grave of a man whose voice had once filled sanctuaries, and whose courage had finally brought a fractured family back together. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true and structured mysteries that reveal the hidden truths buried by time. What part of this story struck you the most? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts and location in the comments. We read every one.